Sheridan Wordsworth.
And I'm Juan Francisco Muñoz, and this is the Geopolitical Pickle.
Disinformation is all around us. It's hard to go on social media these days without being inundated with people trying to manipulate our points of view using a variety of different tricks. That's why we thought it was essential to bring this series to air and explain the risks and the potential remedies against disinformation.
Disinformation Project is a 5-episode podcast where we will be exploring, with experts in the field, the effects of disinformation in the African continent, as well as its development and what are the tools used to spread this disinformation. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Today we are joined by Senior Editor of the Africa Division at Voice of Africa, Salem Solomon, to talk about the interface between disinformation and the traditional media sphere and the social media sphere across Africa. So first of all, thanks very much, Salem, for coming on to join us. And do you mind just giving us a bit of background about yourself?
Thank you. Just a little bit of correction here. It's Voice of America, based in Washington, D.C. This is the Africa Division. I report from the Africa Division, but we have several other divisions. So it's a global entity. We have over about 2,000 employees in our building, but we also have reporters on the ground, every nook and cranny you can think of on the continent. Our division has almost now 17 languages. We're adding one more, which is wonderful. We have, services and language services that broadcast to 50 plus countries. When it comes to my background, I am originally from an East African country called Eritrea, where press freedom is extremely restricted. In fact, until last year or the year before, we were rated under North Korea by, advocacy organizations like Reporters Without Borders or CPJ. They rank yearly based on their press freedom, ranks globally is what I'm talking about. So I come from a very, very restricted in terms of press freedom country. And so coming to VOA is very near and dear to me simply because of that fact. And I can broadcast back to my home country where I am not allowed to practice journalism. So that's my personal note, a little bit note. But in terms of my journalism background, I've had over 10 plus years experience as a reporter, as an editor. I started as a broadcast news anchor in my home country. There's only one TV station in my home country. So I was a Newsly night anchor there. And, it was mostly state media. There's no independent press there. And so coming out of that, what I practiced or what I learned in school was not what I practiced because of the restriction in the country. So after coming to the U.S. here, I've been here for 17 years now. I've worked in newspapers. I've done print journalism. I've done broadcast radio, you name it. I've been in different formats. I've been in VOA for 7+ years now. But although my subject matter expertise is in the Horn of Africa, because I speak 2 of the languages in the Horn of Africa, Amharic mainly and Tigrinya, I have expanded in my coverage, being on inside the division, broadcasting to 50 plus countries, work with colleagues that come from all walks of life when it comes to the continent. We have, as I mentioned earlier, a broad range of coverage that we broadcast to these countries. So I work closely with several services here, and we have an effort here at VOA called bridging. What that means is that if a program or reporting is limited within one language, I work with the reporters closely so that it's available in English that would be used within other services and broader international audience as well. So it's an all-encompassing big operation here. I work with 200 plus people here and more on the ground. So it's a very exciting job, and that's how I found myself.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think that's a great introduction. And then that brings me to my first main question, which is specifically around traditional media and the role that traditional media has in basically democratization. As you said, Eritrea has one national state-owned news company. How is the intersection between the free press and the traditional media How does that play out globally and then specifically into the African context?
Very good question. I think just in general, of course, my home country, I mentioned there's a lot of restriction. But in general, when you think about the continent itself, it's always important to highlight that Africa is not really a monolith, And there are, depending on how you count, 54 or 55 countries, and the media environment varies greatly from one country to another. You have countries like, say, for instance, Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa. They have a very well-developed and vibrant free press in these countries. And you get all kinds of mixed stuff, media environment in these countries simply because of the free flow of information that exists in the countries. But they have, specifically the countries that I mentioned, they have long tradition of critical reporting that holds the powerful to account, which is what journalism is all about, and also serves as a critical role as a watchdog in these countries. But even in these countries, with this kind of environment, media differs from the West. You have radio, for instance, which is very powerful, still powerful, by the way, in some places, depending where you go. You have programs geared to different audiences and regions and religions and ethnic groups. And it's a very large continent. And you have also, a wide variety of print media. It's still vibrant in some places, unlike what you see in the West or European countries where print is seeing a very difficult time, ranging from types of, respectable, prominent dailies and hard news reporting, where you have high editorial standards. And then you have tabloids with sensational headlines and, not much allegiance to the truth in some places. So it's a mixed bag what you get on the continent. And when it comes to TV, also, we have very powerful, if you go to South Africa or Kenya, all these, countries where there is a developed media landscape, these networks, the television networks, have some that come from government-owned, government-controlled outlets, and others owned by large conglomerates, or sometimes, in some cases, I've seen even in vibrant places, foreign companies owning these TV outlets. So that's the situation in some larger, freer countries. But much of Africa, however, it doesn't have a free and vibrant press, like what I mentioned in my home country. In fact, according to Reporters Without Borders, 88% of sub-Saharan Africa has a press freedom environment that is, what I'm quoting here, problematic, difficult, and very serious. In the outset of our conversation, my home country is one of them. But, the restriction in these sub-Saharan African countries is well documented by advocacy groups like what I mentioned. 88% is not really something, to be proud of. But in many countries, the media is tightly controlled by state media or by the ruling parties, and retributions against reporters who publish unwanted stories is very common. We see it, and we even have reporters who pay dear price sometimes in war zones. So the landscape of the media is extremely varied depending on where you go. Example I can actually bring up in West Africa. More recently, you see a spate of coups in Burkina Faso and Mali and Niger. They've been accompanied by major regression to press freedom, and that's because we are seeing these coup leaders shutting down the press there. We've seen arrests of reporters, shutting down of media outlets using different reasons, calling them enemies of the state, banning international broadcasters or kicking them out or deporting reporters that are operating in these countries. So you have, depending on what part of the continent you go, this tends to be worse, especially the attack or crackdown on journalists and media houses tends to be worse in single party or autocratic states. But even in countries where there's a multi-party democracies, there can be serious restrictions on press freedom depending on who owns the media outlet and how these journalists operate. And also, funding and money is also a big factor in this, in the way that reporters can go out and seek the truth.
I see that you've mentioned that there is that combination between national and also conglomerate and I assume also local media. What is there the typical media outlets that we know in the West that are basically everywhere, although you always have your national media outlet, but some basically you can access them and they are read in most of the countries in the West. Is this something that may happen in Africa too with foreign outlets or foreign owned outlets? Let's say big ones that go internationally coming from Russia like Sputnik or RT, or coming from the West a little bit more like CNN, BBC,
VOA even.
VOA. Do you perceive that these outlets, although being foreigner, they also have a big impact, or is it more kept in local and national run outlets?
That's a very good and very complex question, because you're talking about different intent when these foreign actors are coming in these countries. That really matters, because when you think about what we do here, our mission, for instance, when you mentioned VOA, our VOA's mission is in places where there's deliberate stifling of information, we present the truth. That's our mission, meaning your tried and true way of doing journalism. That's what we do. The intent is very important. And in terms of foreign actors and the way that they approach these countries, where they approach their journalism, they just want to export their model, what they're doing in their home countries. So I think that's a very good distinction to make when you're talking about foreign media houses. I think that distinction also makes a difference when you're looking at how they're approaching the way that they approach. And it's not just Russia, but there are other actors on the continent when you're thinking about how media houses are formed. But their sole goal that we've seen, the not sole, but like the most important thing that you need to carry with you is, that watchdog role that I talked about earlier, and how we practice journalism is not different than that you would be reporting here. Here at VOA, for instance, whether we do local U.S. stories or not, we report the truth, whether it's good or bad. That cannot be said. Same cannot be applied in some of the examples that you just mentioned. So that I want to say that in the outset, because I just wanted to make sure that we don't lump all of these media outlets on the same breath. You know what I mean? And so that's very important. That distinction is exactly that, the most important thing. As I mentioned also, I have worked, and I think in the earlier conversations with some of our colleagues, I've read that the distinction that you need to make between media controlled and media owned, I've lived it myself and personal experience, and I'm not speaking for VOA or not. I'm just speaking for myself as a personal capacity. When your media is controlled by a political, party or government, you have no say, and you are just going to stick to the script. But when you have funding and you have independence, like what we have free, independent to make journalistically sound, no interference from any political actors. What you're doing is you're just getting as close as possible to the truth. You report the truth, and you have higher quality and editorial standards. So you are practicing journalism daily. So those are the two distinctions. But when it comes to other governments that want to emulate what they're doing in their home countries, and I'm talking about autocracies, since we're referencing democracies, autocracies, when you have a restricted media, when you don't, when you make an effort to only report about something that's positive, and I've spoken, I'll give you an example. I've spoken to reporters that cover for different media outlets that are funded by other actors. Some have, some come from difficult financial situations, and so whenever there's a money involved, there's also ethical issues that are being questioned in terms of the way they report. So these things really matter when you're looking at what foreign media houses that you're talking about. But our mission has always been, and continues to be, and it's more important now than ever, I believe, simply because of the existence of disinformation and misinformation, other falsehoods, and more challenges that we're seeing daily with deepfakes and artificial intelligence coming in, voices being tampered with, synthetic faces appearing as humans. We are seeing more challenges. And so that means that our work is cut out for us. And so getting close to the truth has become more difficult, but that's our mission.
I think that was a very good background. Now, I just want to go into a couple of different sort of points to go. First of all, like, I want to understand, like, as you said, like, the intent is what really matters about the message that's being delivered. If your intent as VOA is to deliver the message that's the truth of what's happening on the ground, and we see other actors doing something quite different to that. As you said, if we look at Russian autocracy, they're promoting a similar message in their own country. But I think to understand that people on the ground need some level of media literacy and to understand and be able to distinguish the differences between the different actors, whether it's VOA, BBC versus Sputnik, RT, countries as media outlets like this, which have very different goals in mind, but their message is presented in the same way deliberately, I think, by other actors to promote it as the truth, to promote it as equivalent to the reporting that you do. So what sort of media literacy do you see across the continent? And then secondarily to that, has social media affected this literacy in any way?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Two separate questions. First, I'll tackle the one about what kind of media literacy efforts do we have here. The prevalence of disinformation. By the way, again, another concept that's lumped together with the misinformation and fake news, whatever, which I hate the word. I shouldn't say hate, but I am not a proponent of the phrase fake news, because I feel like it's an oxymoron that basically perpetuates what it tries to do to us, meaning discrediting the work that we do. And so I mean, if it's fake, it's not news. It should not be used together. I don't know who said this at some point, but it's really resonated with me, and I've repeated it every chance I get every time somebody says fake news. It's very important to say it again and again, because I feel like people just lump these ideas together, and they're completely different things. When you think about disinformation, for instance, disinformation is a deliberate act of just based on, like, some actors would come up stories out of thin air, okay, just to distort, confuse, create chaos so that everybody's losing track of where the truth was or what the news is about. So it's completely different efforts we're talking about here. So the first question about media literacy, we have at VOA, we have an initiative called Polygraph. This is an effort that includes explainers of complex issues and events. They have a daily reporting that really, really seeks out the truth. They go to social media to see who's spreading falsehood about a certain issue and tackle it head on. It's been folded within the VOA News website. And so if you go to our main web page, you'll see fact checks, and under it, like, we tackle, and it's not just certain regions. It's a global initiative. If we see, say, for instance, from our reporting in Africa, we touch base with our colleagues there, and we say, this is a falsehood being spread here, can you fact check it? And then we do fact checking efforts. We've seen other fact checking efforts because of the prevalence of falsehoods online. In journalism right now, this has been a huge challenge. And we can't just, be on the defense sometimes because of the scale in which these falsehoods are spreading. Some of it is done by machines. And so it's an industrial, scale. And so humans cannot, you can't play whack-a-mole with every falsehood and disinformation that's coming your way. It's very difficult. Journalism itself you're not in it for the money. You're doing it as a public service and public good. So it's time consuming. And so, but I think taking a proactive approach to telling the truth has also been an effort that a lot of newsrooms have taken. I just mentioned one, especially in our newsroom. Polygraph is one effort, but we also go around training reporters. And you mentioned what is the media literacy of what is the stage of media literacy in places that we cover. So earlier when we were talking about VOA, I mentioned there's an umbrella organization called USAGM, the United States Agency for Global Media. Under it, VOA, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, you mentioned, is based in Prague, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting Network. We have different entities that focus on different regions, and they have a media development department, and they go out, and if you look for USAGM training, they go out to different newsrooms on either the continent or even outside in different regions, ongoing conversations about disinformation, ongoing conversations about, how to spot misinformation. Is it an uncle that's sending unintentionally, a misleading tweet saying that this is the truth? Or around elections, you see a lot of misinformation spreading around elections, which makes it tied to democratic efforts. And so we have ongoing training with reporters that operate in these countries that we broadcast. But that doesn't mean that the media literacy is, equal in places. It really depends on the level of media, and also where and are they in urban places? What kind of medium do they get their news? There are different factors that impact it. And so identifying where there's a need, especially, as I mentioned, with deepfakes, videos being produced, even for me and you, we might have trained eyes to spot some things, but it's really increasingly becoming more and more difficult. It's extremely difficult to, and the thing is, when you talk to people that have seen something with their own eyes or listen to a broadcast with their own ears, it's very hard to challenge that, because it's, their comeback could be, I saw it with my own eyes. I heard it with my own ears. And that's the kind of difficulty that we're dealing with. And we're not talking about some, media expert, or we're talking about average people that we speak to in places that we broadcast. The second question about social media usage, increasingly, as you know, many people rely on social media for their news, and this is not unique to Africa.
Although Africa is also the place that it's grown more percentually in the world, no?
Not just more, and it's because of the nature in which the environment where people feel that there's free access to information, and if you cannot afford TV or radio, you can go to internet cafe, or the level of access varies. And in fact, right before our conversation, I looked into a Geopoll survey. It's based here in the U.S. It's a company that looks at trends. It's found that social media has become the preferred source of breaking news or interactive content on the African continent. 57% of the continent's population relies on social media for its top source. And this figure that I just mentioned is even higher among young people. And Africa is known to be the youngest continent, as you'll find as well, and you've reported extensively on the continent. So another poll that I looked at also says that social media users on the continent found that Facebook to be the most popular, with 82% of participants actively using the platform. So TikTok also follows closely, 60%. Compared to Facebook. Facebook is still more popular in most parts of Africa, with 80+%. And then Instagram is 54% of participants Anyway, all of these numbers, Twitter 49%. So it depends. If you go to Kenya, South Africa, and all these places, you see vibrant Twitter. Actually, some people on Twitter could really come at you if they feel like they really need to voice their opinion. So it has there's a democratization of publishing information and disseminating it. But with that also, it makes it far more difficult for governments and more expensive for governments to stifle information. But what kind of information are we talking about? That's where the nitty gritty, the details matter in those instances. In fact, whenever we report with respected media outlets like VOA, the BBC, and others, some who are media literate would see something as a lead on social media, but they always come to VOA to confirm if it's true or not. So the value of traditional media has not really, it still has value. If VOA said so, this must be true kind of approach to news, which is very comforting for some of us who work day and night to get close to the truth. We have reporters on the ground that seek the truth every day. So it is comforting to see. But it doesn't mean that, governments don't restrict, even if it's, you see the impact of traditional media still having some sort of impact because of how, readily available any news is, even made up news is. The other effect that this has had on traditional media is that when people go to social media, although now, newsrooms are also making an effort to go to social media because of where the audience is, traditional media has lost readers and viewers and ad revenue, and, reporters are being laid off as a result, which also impacts the way that news is gathered, and it's costly to get the truth, and so it has a kind of mixed impact on traditional media. But African countries and African governments have also looked at ways to control access to social media, and we've seen several autocracies that shut down the internet whenever a big event happens. Protests are very, very common. I've seen it in my reporting in Ethiopia. I've seen it in reporting in Nigeria. I actually remember a more recent example in 2021. Nigeria banned Twitter for 6 months because of protests. And I think the then president, Muhammadu Buhari, tweeted to ban Twitter, which was very funny, actually. People were like, oh, so he used Twitter to ban Twitter. But there are efforts by governments to stifle information. Another example, other countries like Ethiopia, for instance, they've routinely shut down internet access during times of domestic unrest, protests, or during the war, a very grueling war that recently happened. Social media has been used for attacking people, has been used for targeting people, has been used for disseminating extremely traumatizing videos that some of us were exposed to ourselves reporting on the war. And so it really has like a mixed impact on the users as well. And the social media has been, leading a boom in incendiary speech, like hate speech was used on these platforms, misinformation, deepfakes, and other efforts to control or manipulate the public or sway public opinion. So it really depends on where you go. I just mentioned 2 examples because of the large number of population that 2 countries have, Nigeria and Ethiopia. But depending on where you go, it really depends what kind of social media usage and why it's being used.
Yeah, I was just going to say, before I pass across to you, Juan, just to share my anecdotal experience, because obviously I lived in Zimbabwe, and a few different things that you said there very much apply to the Zimbabwean context, whether that's between the difference between urban and rural divide in terms of media literacy. I know if you go to a rural village in Zimbabwe, their only source of media would have been a radio in the village, and they have one radio station which is government controlled. So then you're getting one view, where if you go to the city, obviously there's a better media literacy, there's a better understanding. But then social media, I think, has changed that somewhat. We see in the villages there now, some people have smartphones and they're able to access news, and then especially fake news. And I guess there's not the history with dealing with different and a critical view of media in these environments. And then we see how quickly fake news through WhatsApp groups and things like this can propagate through these rural communities. And then again, whenever the Zimbabwean government feels threatened, whenever there's protests, the media straight away shut down. Not even just Twitter, but the whole internet. And that's not unique to Zimbabwe, on the African continent for sure. And I think that all serves to highlight the importance of having a trusted traditional media source that people can go to when they have doubts about whether this is the truth or whether this is some misinformation or disinformation, deliberately or not, that's being targeted at people. And I think that definitely highlights the job and the role that organizations such as Voice of America have in that sphere still, and the increased importance.
That brings me to a question, actually, because we can see in our context that traditional media in some sectors of the population, especially age, lost track and lost trust even, and using that. Has that, you've mentioned many times that is a big landscape, so obviously it will depend from country to country, but has that actually changed in that sense? Do you perceive that traditional media for some parts of the population, again, especially the young, it's a little bit more difficult for it to be introduced? And so, like, as you mentioned, you have social media that is much more accessible, that they use it much more. Has that impact the way you are creating this social media content? Has that impact the way traditional media approaches the information, especially for certain sectors of the population?
Yeah, I mean, newsrooms do identify that gap in terms of how easily accessible social media has become for users. And, if you write news or broadcast, why would you want to air it in one medium if you don't want people to listen to it, right? So you have to go where the audience is. So it wouldn't be smart for newsrooms not to consider social media as part of their broadcasting medium. So I mean, it's complicated because of rights and things like that come when you're broadcasting in these platforms. You're giving all kinds of freedom. But VOA, as I said, what we want to reach as many people as possible with the truth. That's our mission. So we go where the audience is. You mentioned WhatsApp in Zimbabwe. Our Zimbabwe service has a WhatsApp group that broadcasts, shares news daily. And other newsrooms also on the continent, they have created magazine formats where they send PDF attachments so that people can download it and read news that way. So it's more about making it more accessible to people that you're reaching out to. Has that made it more difficult when it comes to trust? I think that's what I heard from your questioning. Trust. Is it trust in traditional media? So trust has been a very difficult thing for journalism simply because of the nature and what we do. We're not out here to make friends. Although I'm trying to be friendly to you guys, but when you're in the process of seeking truth is not comfortable to some, especially for those who are holding public office, for those who are doing wrong. When you're exposing wrongdoing, you're not going to make a lot of friends. It's just by nature of what we do. And also because we work in the news business, we work to shed light to some problematic areas, shed light to make public service, to make people aware of their rights, or, it really depends on just the nature of journalism is very uncomfortable in terms of seeking the truth. So by nature, trust usually deteriorates when you are reporting what some might perceive as negative, although you're doing it in the name of public service, Is it proximity? Is your safety being impacted? So there's a value in why we do news. Is your safety threatened? Is it corruption? Holding public officials to account? All of these, by design, make the audience a little bit, tired when you're having negative news all the time. And so that, by the nature of journalism, is like that. And by that also, uh, although you see positive impact where people feel like you have their best interest and they see result as a result of reporting, you see an impact, change in behavior, change in policy, change in positive change in places that we cover. Journalism has had a really positive role to play. That said, that's not the case. You can't. Trust is a very, very delicate thing. Credibility, trust is something you earn over time. Our organization has been around for 80 years. So with time, people know that your credibility is based on the reporting that we do. So traditional media still plays a role, as I mentioned. Like even when some audiences see stuff online, they go to traditional media, even if they don't like reporters, they still come to confirm. Um, what did this reputable organization say? And us ourselves also, we have a two-source rule where even if we get the news immediately, we don't jump because it's breaking news. We make sure that our credibility is on the line. We make sure that we verify information before we use it. That's why editors are here. We make sure that we have second sourcing, or we have seen it with our own eyes. We stay true to what we see. And so we try to maintain trust, doing all these things that I just talked about, but also other factors like disinformation, which is what we're talking about today, really play a negative role in the way that trust is deteriorating in the audience. So there are deliberate efforts to not only discredit, but deliberate made up stories that confuse people. And Africa, because it has nascent democracies and also media literacy that you mentioned, is not really up to par in some places. A number of observers have tracked the surge of disinformation campaigns on the continent, and they're being funded by state actors, namely, say China and Russia, but extremist groups, political parties, religious extremists have used and understand the role media can play, and have used these platforms to sow confusion in places that we broadcast. So, they paint reporters sometimes as spies and things like that, that you're not listening to the message anymore, you're attacking the messenger. So you will see that, especially in autocracies where there's no free flow of information. Another report that I saw before I talked to you looked at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies that does disinformation reports on the continent, and you might be familiar with them. I'm looking at the report that they've done, and there's a stark difference. And they were able to identify 189 disinformation campaigns. That's a lot. When I say industrial scale, I'm like, think about the level of human power and energy you would be spending just to take a defense, to share truth, basically, or to do journalism in its form. And these campaigns happened within the early 2024, just within 1 year, and we're halfway through this year, and that is nearly quadrupled the number reported in 2022. So it's only getting more intense, especially as the interest of foreign actors increases. But simply, some of these actions are tied to, it's all a multi, interlinked effort. Usually the scale varies simply because they want to have political interference or economic interests. Say, for instance, when Russia crafts a disinformation campaign, these campaigns are often aiming to influence elections, promote political narratives that aligns with Russia, or some disinformation operations in Africa are part of a global, strategy aimed at undermining democratic systems to sow division. And so you have to look at it from a broad perspective and why these things happen. Nearly 60% of disinformation campaigns on the continent are foreign state sponsored. So I mentioned as an example Russia, but there's China, there's UAE, United Arab Emirates doing this, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and some other countries involved. So it's not really one country or two countries doing this. For their own state interest, there are disinformation campaigns, especially if they come from autocratic countries. We see these campaigns, according to the report that I just saw. And Russia, more specifically, according to the report I'm mentioning, is the largest sponsor of disinformation in Africa. And they're sponsoring 80 documented campaigns targeting more than 22 countries. And most of these countries that they target are places like we just saw a spate of coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. Prior to it's very hard to connect the coup events of coup with social media campaigns, but it is very interesting. These social media campaigns are very concentrated around time when there's election, when there's a political movement, when there's any crack within these societies that are easily manipulated. Like, so they use these moments to deliberately target countries like that. So it's well documented. Russia has used a wide variety of traditional and new media to try to push out a narrative, sow doubt, confusion. The message usually varies by country, but typically they seek to foment anger against the West or the United Nations or, international bodies. They've also sought to discredit health initiatives like vaccinations, anti-malaria efforts, positive efforts that help really average people on the ground that need these kind of efforts. But anyway, the goal usually that we've seen is to promote Moscow and also its mercenary proxies. The formerly with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group, and also now they've changed the name, and now they're not. Yeah, Africa, of course, it's not as hidden as it used to be. Basically, pretending to be an independent company, but now it is directly funded. It was before, but it's just, their fighters were using Russian passports to travel all these places. We've done extensive reporting on the Wagner Group. We continue to do. I'm very interested to report on the places that the group has claimed to make a difference when we're seeing increased civilian deaths in places where they are providing security. But most of their interest is tied to mineral resources, countries where there are mineral resources. They do say that they're providing security, but we see increased civilian deaths in places that we cover. So all of this disinformation factor I'm mentioning is to come back to your question about trust. So there are deliberate efforts to discredit traditional media outlets so that trust is eroding. And it all interlinks with this bigger idea that they have when a certain, I mentioned Russia as an example, but there are other actors also, as I said, in the group and the reports that we've seen, very well documented efforts to sow confusion and spread disinformation.
So with that, I think we can get a little bit, because you've actually summarized a couple of the questions that we wanted to ask you. Thank you very much. Really, definitely super comprehensive. You clearly have the experience. We want to finish with a question of how can the battle for truth be won within the African context? You've mentioned it throughout the interview. There is different landscapes. There's been different disinformation campaigns. There's different media environment in the countries.
It's very combative to even frame the question that way, if you're honest. Like, this is my personal, I'm a journalist. Like, I'm an editor, a journalist. So I see things, even like, these governments that have different intents and efforts. Our mission also is whether, they respond to our requests or not. We reach out to all sides. As I said, we try to get close to the truth as possible, especially when in times of war, when we've seen it with the Russia war and other wars that we've covered, before the Russia-Ukraine war, before the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I should say. there's been so many wars that we've covered. In fact, the biggest war that I covered right before this Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the war in Ethiopia. They claim thousands of people have been killed as a result of more than 2.5 years. Imagine the span of time and the number of people. Anyway, the reason why I'm saying this, there's always two sides in these warring parties whenever there's war involved. So in these instances, what you see when there are two sides involved, their intent, both parties, the warring parties, have different efforts. I'll give you an example in the Tigray War, for instance. The key actors during that time were the Ethiopian government and the then ruling party of the region. So their disinformation campaign, for instance, wanted to confuse, say, for instance, international community so that, people cannot get close to policymakers, cannot really understand what's going on. And so when they're confusing their public, they're also confusing the world in terms of the way that news is coming out, So these disinformation campaigns have a goal to not only confuse, but also to change the narrative in a way that aligns with whoever is disseminating it. So in journalism, we try our best. We have different initiatives. I wouldn't say win the war. I would say, what can we do to make a difference in terms of educating the public, connecting with the public, or informing them, and in the name of basically democracy and freedom, which is where we can't take, even democracy is so fragile here in the U.S. So we can't take anything for granted. So we know the value that journalism can play as a watchdog role in these countries. So we make an effort to, commission stories on the ground, try to get as close as possible in places where it's very difficult. We hide the names of the people that might, put themselves in danger to get stories for us. So we do continue the traditional way of collecting news. We go where the audience is, and in places where we can't reach, we try to make initiatives that are educating the public. So we go out and have trainings about the distinction between disinformation and misinformation. We have ongoing sessions, because these forms of disinformation or platforms are always changing. As we speak, could be different tomorrow. So we are always adapting to new changes, trying to meet either our audience or also train our reporters to be safe in places that they cover. We do pay a very heavy price in some places where reporters have been targeted, arrested, and recently, I think you might have seen the prisoner swap. The Russian government was asking for basically convicted criminals to be exchanged with journalists. And so this is the kind of risk that our reporters are taking on a daily basis. So even with that, we continue how we could be, one, invest in journalism as much as possible, invest in the act of telling the truth and holding the powerful to account, and also making sure that you build trust with your audience. I think we try to do that every day as much as we can. We go to all these platforms. We train our reporters. We have different initiatives trying in this effort, trying to combat. And also, by the way, AI could also be used positively, and we've seen efforts, for instance, fact checkers, because as I said, some of these industrial scale AI efforts are used by negative actors, but positive actors could also use it for positive. And there are so many examples. Africa Fact Check, who were inspired by a fact-checking organization here in St. Pete, Florida, which I used to go to school and work, was inspired, and they opened their Africa Check platform. I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. There's one initiative. There are other initiatives that fact check regional or country specific fact checking efforts that go on. So I wouldn't say it's a battle to be fought because of the nature in which every day it's changing. But we change with the environment and try to stay true to what we know and report what we know and stay true to the truth. Um, if that is a tactic that has worked, I think that's a tactic that's worked in the past, and we just have to change where the platform is changing, but keep doing what we're doing, and that's how we are going about doing it.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Salem. It's been fantastic. I think we've barely scratched the surface of like the role that traditional media has to play.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I could have given you specific examples, but we just wanted to broadly touch on it.
Exactly. I mean, even just talking about the Sahel, you can draw a direct line
Oh
from
my
these
gosh.
disinformation activities to the breakdown of democracies there and the rise of authoritarianism. And it's very clear when you look at the actions and then the result. But I think you've given us a fantastic summary.
Actually, I was in Europe just a couple of, was it end of 2023 or May or something? I was in Vienna, and the panel that I sat on was about truth about lies, which is very clever. But it was talking about, I was giving specific examples of deepfakes with videos that were broadcast in Burkina Faso prior to the coup, and they used WhatsApp, they used all these platforms. And the funny thing about AI, and I saw the AI tool that they used to create these campaigns. They were using platforms that you can quickly come up with if you have access to the internet. It would take you just basically, I don't know, I don't even know if you pay for it. I tried it for free. It took me longer than it would take you if you pay. Anyway, they would create these content, the videos, but they were not really native English speakers. So you could see if you are trained. If you're not trained, if you're in the boondocks of like Burkina Faso, whatever it is, they were pretending to be Americans, trying to say something so they can confuse people. And it was very powerful. During that panel, when I showed the video, everybody was like, what in the heck is going on here? Like, if you see these videos, they look so real. And they're saying these very convoluted messages about neo-colonialism and things very foreign to what's happening here in the US. So there's all kinds of campaigns and examples to talk about. But yeah, as I said, Africa's 50 plus countries. It's very hard to cover it all in a couple of minutes. But yeah.
Exactly. Well, we greatly appreciate your time and
yes, thank you very much.
So yeah, I think thanks very much for coming on, and we'll see you next time on the Geopolitical Pickle.
Ciao, ciao.